Joel, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Lauren, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. To give kind of people a little bit of a background, we are at the tail end of our current podcast series called Who's in Your Circle. And we're just taking a look at these really important relationships that kids ministry leaders have that impact the way that they lead and the way that they lead for the long haul. And I really wanted to get someone like you who has this counseling background that also deeply loves the local church, just to talk about this relationship between a ministry leader and a counselor and the importance of that relationship. But before we dive into all the questions, why don't you give us a little bit of background on you, talk to us about your family, and then talk to us about your job.
Yeah. So I'm in Fort Worth, Texas. I am a co-owner of Fort Worth Counseling and Intervention, and I'm also a counselor here. So I run the practice, but I also still work with clients. I am born and raised in the church, started counseling in the church, actually, through just being in a leadership role. I for a brief season, was a children and youth pastor and got to do some counseling while I was in the church there, and had a lot of affirmation or confirmation maybe from some of the people that got to witness that this was a gift that the Lord had given me. And so started to pursue counseling a few years after that. I have a wife, Danielle. She's awesome. She helps us run the practice here. Her and I have a podcast together that we haven't launched yet, but we've recorded maybe 8 episodes, and so we're looking forward to launching that later this year. And that's a podcast where we talk all things mental and emotional health, and I speak from the clinician side, and she speaks from the average Joe side of things, and challenges a lot of what I say, and so we get to debate on there and talk about some cool things. And I have a daughter, Silver. She's 8 in 2nd grade this year. She's awesome. She's my twin, essentially. And so the three of us have a lot of fun. We have a cool family life. She thinks that she's a part owner in the practice as well, and is everybody's boss. Cool. So that's always fun to deal with. And yeah, so I've been counseling for 6, almost 7 years now. I got into counseling because of my own marriage, and we have a story where we almost got divorced in 2013, and through the church kind of supporting us, but then really where we found the most help and relief was going to a marriage counselor and getting some help there. And so we're going on 13 years of marriage now. 13 or 14, I can't remember. 14. We were married in 2010. That helps me remember it. So we're going on 14 years of marriage now, and that for me just encouraged me to want to step in and be able to help other people the same way that we were helped. And so my specialty, one of them is marriage. So about 50% of my practice is marriage counseling. And then the other 50% is anger and anxiety. I absolutely love anger. Love working with it. I really enjoy working with anxiety and teaching people how emotions work and how to be free from that. Our goal with the podcast and kind of my goal as a clinician is to help people reach emotional freedom. When I think about scripture, it's for freedom that we've been set free. We typically think about being free from sin, but I think God has allowed the opportunity for us to be free in all facets, and that means emotionally too. And so I'm really passionate about helping people become emotionally free.
That's so good. Thanks for sharing, Joel. Those are some really great things. And you shared part of your story, and we love to hear those stories of redemption and the way that you're serving your community now, which is great. And I can't wait for the podcast. I think that's going to be so fun to listen in on your conversation and or a debate. But I would love to kind of ask you the first question, and it's really a generic question, kind of setting the foundation for this conversation. Now, not everybody that's listening has a counselor. Not everybody is actively going to a counselor. And sometimes people go in and out of seasons of going to a counselor more consistently and then not seeing one for a while. But I would love for you kind of just to give some insight on why do you think it's important, but speak specifically for the ministry leader. We kind of talked about this before we hit record, but sometimes there's this negative connotation with counseling, like something is wrong or something needs to be fixed. And we kind of talked about how most culture is coming out of that a little bit, not being, not having this such negative look on counseling. But from your perspective, why do you think it's important? What benefits could there be from a ministry leader going to counseling on a regular basis?
So just to kind of circle back to the last point I made, I think if we are not working towards emotional freedom, then we are enslaved. And I think we are called to be free from being enslaved, and in being able to focus on being free emotionally is a really big deal. Whenever we're not free emotionally, it plays such a big role in our relationships. It plays a big role in the ways that we may or may not act out in unhealthy or harmful ways. And so being aware of that and learning what it looks like to be able to engage with your emotions in a healthy way and process through them and decide how you're going to move through the world is a really big deal. And I think it's just ultimately what it comes down to is that sense of freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And even as you mentioned these things like anger and anxiety, and from your experience in kids and youth, those emotions can come up a lot in ministry, whether you're anxious about an event or volunteers showing up on Sunday or getting all the work done, or maybe you're angry or bitterness is like taking over your emotions based on a decision somebody else made or a way somebody reacted or volunteers not showing up on Sunday. And so there's a lot of those emotions that can go into ministry. What would you say are some key factors or maybe some red flags of, hey, it might be time for you to see a counselor?
So if you're dealing with resentment, for sure, that's a time to see a counselor and be able to work through that. Ultimately, resentment is a really big conversation. There's a lot we could go into there, but we know that as Christians, we are called to forgive, right? And a lot of times, the way that we've been taught to forgive is this idea of like forgive and forget. Which the issue is that doesn't work. We can say I forgive you, but we haven't actually forgiven or released the resentment that we're holding towards people. And so there's an actual process that we can walk through in order to do that, to move from resentment to forgiveness. There's a quote by Nelson Mandela that for me is really powerful. He says, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping that your enemy dies. And so when we think about forgiveness, forgiving someone is actually for the forgiver, not the one you're forgiving. Because what I'm doing is I'm releasing or getting rid of that poison of resentment that I'm carrying within me, right? And so resentment, I think, is a really key indicator. I think if you're struggling with intrusive thoughts, where you're stuck in thinking about something and you can't get it off your mind, that would be a key indicator of I might need to talk with someone and have them help me process through this so I can release it and not be stuck in those thought processes. Anger is always a key indicator. I think anger and anxiety are the two big red flags that we see a lot. And so either of those would be, hey, anxiety, I think our society has normalized anxiety, and anxiety is not normal. So I think it's just important to say to be functioning out of anxiety is not normal or healthy. And so if I am, being able to say, I need help to go talk with someone that can help me work through and process this and not be functioning this way anymore. And the same with anger. I believe that anxiety and anger both function the same way. They both function to protect us from emotions that are unpleasant and that we're uncomfortable feeling. And so when we can start to learn to address those things in healthy ways and actually figure out what we are feeling, the anxiety and the anger start to dissipate because they don't need to exist anymore if there's nothing to protect us from.
Yeah. That's so good. As I'm still thinking about kind of those red flags that come up for ministry leaders, how would you kind of say, okay, this is, sometimes in the church world, people say, well, that's a righteous anger, and this is a red flag anger. Or some people, I loved what you say about like living with anxiety has been such a normal thing for our culture right now. And so is there a point where, oh, this is okay emotions to feel? Like if the night before a big presentation, like you're going to feel some nervousness, where does it flip into not a great state? Is it like you've been dealing with this for a week, a month, or it feels more like this than this? Like what would be some of those things where it's not necessarily righteous anger? And I think that bitterness is a big component of it, but kind of talk more about, like, get more specific into what kinds of anger or anxiety.
Yeah. Great. I'll start with anger and then we can kind of shift into anxiety. The way that I help differentiate between healthy anger and protective anger is anger that is driven by experiencing or witnessing injustice is healthy anger. And that's where I see, and people may disagree with this, but when I think about the story of Jesus flipping tables at the temple, right? Like that's a go-to story for anger and it being okay. So when we look at that, like what was Jesus actually angry about in that moment? And one thing, obviously, they're defiling the temple, which is for the worship of God, and they are worshiping the created over the creator, which was money at that point, right? But it's also anger due to injustice, because those travelers that were coming to the temple, they were taking advantage of them. And so there's an injustice that's happening, and not just is it injustice, but it's injustice in the temple that's meant for worship. So I think being able to recognize that if the anger is being driven by injustice, then that's a healthy form of anger, and it's a legitimate form of anger, right?
Yeah.
Aside from that, any other anger is just protecting us from what I call soft emotions. So it's being driven by I feel hurt, I feel sad, I feel scared, I feel whatever, right? Yeah. And so being able to work through that protective anger is actually us getting underneath that to the emotions that it's trying to protect us from. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. No, that's great.
So then shifting over to the anxiety side, I think it's important to differentiate between fear, anxiety, nervousness, right? Those are three that can get confused for one another a lot. So I would say fear is specific. Nervousness also is specific. Anxiety is general. So when I'm feeling anxiety, I'm feeling something that feels similar to fear, but either I can't pinpoint what it is, or it is a flood of things, right? There's so many things that it's hard to just pinpoint one, because there's so much underneath there. And so I think that's just to try and distill it down to a very simplified version of how to recognize what you're dealing with. If it's a specific thing, we can say that that's fear or nervousness if that's what you're feeling. But whenever it feels more general or more broad, it's probably anxiety. And typically anxiety presents in the body quite a bit too. So heaviness or tightness in the chest, having a hard time taking in a deep breath, different things like that. Many people who deal with anxiety also experience those physical sensations as well.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm grateful that you were able to kind of dive deeper into that, because I feel like in the ministry context, there's a lot of those physical manifestations, or people are always like, oh, it's just for this season. You hear a lot of seasonal language of like, well, let's just get past this season. Like, this is coming up. This podcast will be released right before Easter. And that is one of those seasons where it's like, well, after the season is over, things will be a little bit more calm and my anxiety will go away and I won't be as angry, or like all of these emotions will subside. And the truth of the matter is they probably won't. And it's not just a season. If people are in ministry, you know that you go one season to the next and it's busy and it's busy and it's busy.
Yep.
And I think that's just helpful for people to hear, oh, this is maybe not normal behavior. And I would benefit from speaking to a counselor.
Yep.
So I kind of want to shift gears just a little bit. And there's so many different types of counseling between marriage counseling and just all of those different kind of subcategories. But I would love to talk specifically about church and the church hurt that can happen and the ministry leader. And part of my story, which I don't think I've ever shared publicly on this podcast, but is that we experienced some really horrible season inside of a local church. And it wasn't until we sat down with a counselor was it labeled, you've experienced church trauma. And that was a kind of an eye-opening thing for me because trauma is such a big word. And I've never, in my years of ministry, I'd never connected church and trauma together. And so I would love for you to maybe, if there's a definition for church trauma, or maybe speak to the ministry leader and walk them through, like, if they think they have experienced something in the church that is not normal or should not happen, what do they do?
Yeah, I think so. One, I think that words carry a lot of weight. And so it's important for us to use the proper terminology when trying to describe what we've experienced or gone through.
Yeah.
And when I think about church trauma, sometimes there's some confusion because I deal with church hurt fairly regularly, but we also have counselors here who deal with religious or spiritual trauma, and those things are referring more to spiritual abuse that's happening. Brainwashing and all kinds of other things that are really deeply spiritual and emotional and very traumatic. And so I think being able to look at it from using the term church trauma helps to see that, like, okay, we're talking about some trauma that I've experienced from being in the church or from the church, right? Yeah. I don't know if there's an exact definition of church trauma. Now, whenever I think about trauma, I think a helpful definition. So Dr. Francine Shapiro, she's the founder of EMDR, which is a form of trauma therapy. Something that she says is any event that has had a lasting negative effect on the self or psyche is by its nature traumatic. And so I think that that's helpful because trauma, we tend to think of big traumas like PTSD from soldiers coming back from war, or someone who has experienced intense sexual or physical trauma, or I think maybe you mentioned like a car wreck or things like that, right? But when we think about trauma, it's very individual because different things impact each of us differently. And so something that might be traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me, but it may vice versa on the other side, right? Where I deal with something that's traumatic for me, and for you, you don't experience it that way. And so I typically kind of zoom into church hurt is what I deal with. So just to be honest, I don't know that I've dealt with any clinically, I don't know that I've dealt with somebody who has experienced to the degree of church trauma, because I think there is a difference there, right? Hurt and trauma are two totally different things.
Yeah,
is that
that's
helpful?
really helpful. No, that's great. Would you say that even within trauma, it's not like you've experienced it or you haven't experienced it? Would you say that there's levels inside the definition of trauma as well? Like I don't know how else to describe it. But like little trauma and big trauma, or like not as intense? I don't know. Is that a weird question to ask?
No. That's good. Yeah. I tend to stay away from the like little T, big T trauma. That's like pretty typical to try and differentiate that way. But I like what you just said. And I would actually agree that when we're looking at trauma, there are differing levels or intensities of how we've experienced that trauma, right? And so For some people, they may have a traumatic experience that and really when we think about intensity or levels, it really comes down to your mental and emotional experience when reliving that trauma or when going back to it to try and find healing, right? And so even that is very individual and unique because, again, there may be something that is extremely traumatic for you. I experienced the exact same thing, maybe with the exact same person, and it was traumatic. It's just when I go to deal with it and heal, the intensity level isn't as high as what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. No, that really makes sense. And that's even something that I can think about in my own experience in the church in that difficult season. Like there were different levels of trauma even inside the group of us that were participating in that season. And so that's really helpful to know. Let's zoom in on church hurt for a little bit, since that is an area that you have worked in. I don't know if you see this, and I don't know if this could be a silly statement to make, but I feel like sometimes people throw around the phrase church hurt, and it's maybe not, like you mentioned the kind of a couple minutes ago, of the importance of defining things with the right terms. And I feel like some people throw around the phrase church hurt when really their feelings were hurt over something that is very minimal. And so how do you validate church hurt? Do you just, if someone says I've been hurt by the church, you just say like, okay, let's talk about it? Or has there ever been an experience where you were like, actually, maybe you haven't been, I don't know, it kind of maybe define that a little bit deeper and say like, yes, sometimes people just get their feelings hurt by something that was said or something that was done or whatever happened. And then there's church hurt that is more emotional and spiritual.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important differentiation to make. And so I think there's a few different components. So one, if there are two members of a church who they experience some sort of conflict and one or both of them is hurt by that conflict, that is not church hurt. That just because the relationship is within the church doesn't mean that that's church hurt. That's just hurt in a relationship, right?
Even if one of them is on staff.
Now that's the difference, right? That's where the differentiation happens, because you look at the power dynamic or the authority structure. And so if someone who is in an authority position then does something that's hurtful to someone who's under their authority, that's where we then start to get into the concept of church hurt, right?
Yeah.
Also, now I think that's nuanced as well, because what if I'm in community group with one of my pastors and we have a really close friendship, and then he does something that's offensive or hurtful for me or to me? That I would actually say is less so church hurt and more the first one that we described. That's a friendship, right? That's hurt between two friends. There's not a power dynamic at play there. It's just the relationship, the friendship that's happening, and there's hurt that happens there. And hurt within any relationship is normal. Conflict can be healthy, right? Conflict in and of itself is neutral. It's not positive or negative. It's just neutral. It's how we engage in it that makes it healthy or unhealthy. Most of us experience unhealthy conflict, so that's why when we think of conflict, we think of fighting and arguing and all kinds of things. But I think that is probably the biggest differentiator between church hurt and hurt in the church is I have friendships within the church, and hurt happens within those friendships because we're humans and we're sinners and we hurt each other. And then there's things that the church has done to someone who's under their authority that is hurtful. And so I think that's where we can help understand that. And then really kind of circling back a little bit to the importance of mental and emotional health within the church, what I feel like I've seen is that from the church. And here's where I think some growth and healing could happen is our spiritual life and our emotional life tend to get conflated within the church. And that's our spiritual life and our emotional life, although they do cross over one another, they are two very different parts of us. And so we are not necessarily able to emotionally heal through addressing it spiritually. And so needing to have, and that's the importance of being able to work with a counselor, is having a space to directly address the emotional aspects of what you're experiencing, not just from a spiritual perspective, but from an emotional perspective.
Yeah. Gosh, that's really helpful. Talk to me about church hurt between staff member and staff member. How does that fit in? Because in some ways, like a kids ministry staff member is still under the authority of the lead pastor. And so if something were to happen there, and that's probably the stories that I hear most often, is the lead pastor did something or whatever came to light, and now everyone is like up in arms and navigating this really awful situation. Would that still be considered? Because there is this fine line of like, well, staff members are friends and they're in relationship with one another, and maybe they've been on staff for a decade or more. And so I'm probably answering my own question here, but like that tends to be a gray area where it's like, yes, they're under the leadership, but also they're friends. Can you speak to that like staff on staff dynamic?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there can definitely be church hurt that happens there, and I think church trauma that can happen within that relational dynamic.
Yeah.
While I think it's important to recognize that although the work that staff members within a church are doing is the work of the kingdom, they're still, when we look at that relationally, they're colleagues. So this is like work relationships, not to say that it doesn't cross over into church relationships, but I think it is really important to have some separation there and recognize that within any job, there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be offenses and hurts and all of those things. And so being able to separate that a little bit and not just jump to the idea that it's church hurt because I experienced hurt within a relationship from another staff member or my boss or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Does that help?
No, that's great. And I think it's what I keep coming back to is that it just feels really messy because the church is a family and it is this like weird kind of relationship thing, but you are still colleagues and you are still staff members, and this is your job, and these are people that you work with, but also they could be your best friend, and it just is very gray, which makes it hard, and then it makes it that much worse when you feel hurt. And so if the kids ministry leader is listening and they're like, wow, I feel like I've experienced church hurt, or I feel like I'm living in a very hurtful environment, what would you recommend as some first steps?
So first steps would be, one, creating some sort of space to explore those feelings and get a sense of what they actually are so that you can have some clarity. And that, a lot of the work that I do with couples is learning how to engage in conflict in healthy ways. And a lot of what happens, I think, amongst staff members at a church or really any organization is a lack of conflict resolution and not understanding how to engage in conflict well. And so part of what needs to happen in order for me to engage in conflict well is I need to be able to communicate to you what I am feeling and experiencing, and I need to be clear about that. So if I'm not clear, then we're going to have a really hard time resolving whatever the issue may be there. So that's where it kind of comes back to, do you have a counselor or someone in your life that can counsel you well? I typically don't recommend that just because there's the relational dynamics of personal relationships and counseling and advice. And the benefit you get from working with an actual counselor is that relationship is all about you as the client. So the counselor, a counselor who is doing their job well and is a healthy counselor, does not allow their emotions to play into working with you and processing what you're dealing with. Yeah. They are there as a sounding board to be able to help you discover what you need to discover in order to move forward in whatever direction you need to move forward in.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's great. Would you ever, and this is maybe more of a personal question, would you ever counsel somebody who goes to your church, who is maybe is on staff at your church?
Yes.
Okay, so you'd be able to like separate between like maybe they're talking about my local church community, but I'm here to do my job, basically.
So yes, with a caveat. So as a licensed professional counselor, part of our ethical code, does not allow us to have a dual relationship. And that's so being a counselor and being a part of a local church, there's a little bit of a gray area there. So I do not counsel friends. I do not counsel family, people like that, colleagues. I don't counsel them. But when it comes to the church, although we may be a part of the same church body, if we do not have a personal relationship, then I am more than willing to work with somebody, because that's not going to play into my mindset around the work that we're doing right now. When it comes to like me working with a pastor of a church that I'm a part of, I wouldn't be against that. I would not do that with the church I'm at, because I have personal relationships with the elders of our church. And so I would not counsel them. But just looking at that overall as a theory, I don't think that there would be anything wrong with that. If, so the way that our church is structured, we have multiple elders. And so if you're in a church like that and there's an elder that you don't have a relationship with and is looking for counseling and you would be a good fit for that person, then I don't think that there's anything against that. Yeah.
No, that's helpful, because I think sometimes kids ministry leaders run into, well, I can't talk to anybody at my church about what's going on in my church. They run into this issue, and I think it's okay to look outside of, the counselor doesn't necessarily need to be a part of your church body. They can be a part of a church down the street. Do you feel like there's an important factor to going to a counselor who is a believer?
I think I've never been asked that specific question. It's a good question. I think it's helpful, right? Because so I am not a Christian counselor. I'm a counselor who is a Christian, and there is a big difference there. And
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I differentiate that because I counsel people with a Christian worldview, but I allow my clients to decide whether or not they want to bring their spiritual life into the work that we do. Because some people want to be able to separate that a little bit and try and deal with things on more of a thought level or an emotional level or things like that. And so, you asked that question, and I'm kind of brainstorming right now out loud because I don't know. I think that where I would land without really putting a ton of thought into it is I think it would be helpful because that person has a similar worldview. And it's going to be difficult to process things when there's two differing worldviews, especially if they're vastly different, right? If you have an atheist as a counselor or something like that, it's going to be a little difficult to feel the sense of trust that you need to have within the counseling relationship. And that's probably the biggest component is like, whenever my job for a client is for me to create a safe, secure place where they can open up and process and talk through and work through whatever they need to work through without judgment, for me to be here to validate them, but also to challenge maybe some thoughts that are unhealthy or irrational or whatever. And that's going to be hard to do if you don't have a level of trust for that person.
Yeah, for sure. That's helpful. Do you think it's possible to work through or navigate the church hurt and still remain on staff? I think that's a big question that a lot of kids ministry leaders are asking of. Is it time for me to go because of this hurt, or can there be reconciliation? And I think, of course, like, God can do a lot of things inside relationships, and there's always an opportunity for reconciliation. But do you feel that you most see people walk away from a job after church hurt, or have you seen people be able to work through the situation and still work together with that person?
I think it depends on the dynamic of the relationship where the hurt is occurring or has occurred. If one, I think it's not helpful to make a decision solely based on emotions. That tends to be harmful. Not always, but tends to be harmful. So I think it is important to take the time and expend the mental, emotional energy to really process and have an understanding of what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what you feel like needs to be communicated. It's to kind of answer the first question, I definitely think that it's possible to reconcile and continue to be able to work there. I don't think if you reach a certain level of hurt, it means, oh, time to go. I need a bounce, right? Now, I do think all right, I'm trying to divide this out because it's a little complex, but there's a few different components that I think are important to address. So, one, are you clear about what you feel? And do you feel like you can communicate that in a healthy way to that particular person or those particular people? Secondly, do you feel like, and this kind of circles back to the counseling relationship again, do you feel like if you're able to reconcile with this person, that you would be able to trust them again? Or get to a level of trust that feels okay? Because that's also a big piece too, where if someone's thinking about leaving a church because of church hurt, so this goes outside of staff, but I think it applies to both. If someone is thinking about leaving a church, one of the things that I would consider is, if we were to reconcile this situation, am I able to trust the leadership of that individual again? Because if I'm not able to reach that level of trust again, then we're going to continue to have issues. And I'm not actually going to be submitting to the authority that I say I'm willing to submit to whenever I become a member of whatever that church is, right? And so that's like, we're looking at it from a boss to or colleague perspective, but then we're also looking at it from a leadership perspective. And do I trust the leadership and am willing to put my trust in them? And then I think also the reconciliation piece, where I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this too. When I'm thinking about moving from resentment to forgiveness, my belief from what I see in Scripture is that God commands us to forgive. God does not command us to reconcile. We are commanded to forgive. And again, it kind of circles back to that idea that if I'm not forgiving somebody, then I am holding resentment in my heart towards that person. And so I'm willingly poisoning myself, right? I believe that we can control three things: our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And therefore, that's all we're responsible for, is our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so because of that, I can control working through the emotions that have driven to a level of resentment and extending forgiveness to somebody. I can control that. Once I get to reconciliation, that actually requires change on one or both ends of that relationship. And I can't control whether or not that person wants to reconcile. I can't control whether or not they're willing to make those changes. I can't control whether or not they're willing to respect certain boundaries that I may try to set up. So there's a lot of components to reconciliation that are outside of my control. And so I believe that that's why God doesn't command us to reconcile. He does encourage us to reconcile, because when we do, it's a beautiful picture of a perfect God reconciling sinful man to himself. But there are so many components of that we can't control, that God's not going to command us to do something that we have no control over.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense. And I think that thinking back to my own season in counseling and just what I've walked through, like that was one of the big topics of conversation was you can't go into a conversation with this person expecting them to like offer forgiveness or ask for forgiveness. You just can't place that expectation because you might be disappointed. And that has carried me through a lot of conversations where maybe there was a hurtful situation or something like that. And it's just like, you know what? All I can do is show up and own my feelings, own my thoughts, and own my own actions, and kind of name that in a way that's very healthy, very respectful, and see what happens. And I think that's just an encouraging thing to do. Like even going back to, can you even name what you're feeling? And just walking through that process of, oh, this happened, here's what I felt. And then maybe asking the question or answering the question, here's what I actually felt.
Right.
Going back to like, well, I'm angry. Well, why are you angry? Well, because you feel hurt or you feel scared or you feel sadness. Like, I think it's just helpful to answer those questions and be able to say, hey, can I approach this person and say it in a way that's God honoring and respectful and not getting heated and not yelling and like having a respectful conversation. I think that is a huge like accomplishment in your own emotional health and your emotional journey. And so I would agree. I think in some circumstances you walk away and in some you can stick it out. And I do think for the kids ministry leader, it is, are you attuned to the Holy Spirit? And are you attuned to where he's asking you to go? And if he's asking you to stay, then what does that look like? And if he's asking you to go, can you be obedient in that? And there's a lot of factors for a ministry leader stepping down from their role. And sometimes it's really hard and is not great, but I think there's opportunity for reconciliation, and forgiveness and moving on. Like you can even reconcile and then say, okay, now I'm going to move on. And you don't need to leave a church just because you didn't reconcile. You can reconcile and say, it's also my time to go.
Yeah.
And that can be hard too.
Yeah.
So,
well, and even,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, even you mentioning, where's the Holy Spirit leading you? Is he asking you to stay or asking you to go? And even in there, maybe he's letting you choose. Maybe he's not leading you one way or the other, but saying whatever you want to do. Either way is going to be okay, right? And but I think the important component that you're talking about is being in tune with the Holy Spirit, so that you at least have an idea. And kind of a piece that you were discussing there, which I think this is where we get stuck in the church so many times, is you were talking about, addressing the emotions. What am I actually feeling, or why am I feeling angry, and getting down to being able to name the specific emotions that I'm experiencing. And what you're describing is validation. And that's what we miss in the church, because when we conflate our spiritual life and our emotional life, we get hyper-focused on truth. And truth is important. Truth does matter. We don't just dismiss the truth. But when we're working through emotional hurt, we don't start with the truth. We end with the truth. And so that a big piece that we struggle with is, I may express that I'm feeling some kind of way to somebody in the church or somebody who's counseling me in the church, and the message that I'm receiving, whether it's being said explicitly or it's just being implied, is that for me to feel that way is wrong or sinful. And I would argue that no emotions are wrong, bad, or sinful. All emotions are good. We have pleasant emotions and unpleasant emotions, but an unpleasant emotion isn't bad or wrong. It's just unpleasant. And
Yeah.
that God created us as emotional beings. And so the emotions that we experience are good. It's healthy for us to experience our emotions and to be able to process through them. Now, when those emotions are driving our actions constantly, that's where it becomes unhealthy and at times sinful.
Yeah.
And so it's not that having those thoughts or emotions is bad or sinful. It's what are we doing with those emotions and thoughts whenever they do come up? Are we allowing ourselves to address them in a way that's healthy? Can I validate what I'm feeling? And maybe this is helpful too. Anything that you've ever felt, that I've ever felt, anybody listening has ever felt is valid because it's very real to them in the moment.
Yeah.
But feelings can be valid and true, or they can be valid and untrue. And so what that does is it frees us up to validate what we're feeling or validate what other people are feeling. And then once I feel heard, understood, validated, I am much more likely to hear you help me process that through the truth of Scripture. But
Yeah.
if you immediately go to what's true and not true, now I feel like I can't actually feel anything because it's wrong. And then I wonder why I stay stuck in this cycle of these same emotions and thoughts coming up again and again and again, because each time they do, they get suppressed with truth. Truth is here to set us free, not to suppress us. And so when we can just flip the order of how we address our emotions, it actually allows us to work through and process those things in a way where we're able to release them rather than them being stuck in that cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. That's such a great, encouraging word. I want to spend the last couple minutes flipping it a little bit. And for the kids ministry leader, most of them don't have a counseling degree. And so, but they're often put in situations where they are walking alongside families who've experienced suffering. And most of them are like, I don't know what to do. I think the number one question I see on like kids ministry Facebook groups and forums is like, this child just lost a parent. What do I do? Or this kid has cancer. What do I do? And I would love for you to spend kind of the last couple minutes encouraging kids ministry leaders on tips and tricks on how to journey with families well in suffering.
Network. Find good counselors in your area that you can trust. Counselors that have a Christian worldview where you can refer people, because unless you're a counselor or a therapist, you are not equipped to walk with people through grief and suffering the way that they may need in that season. You're equipped to be able to step in and love them well. You're not equipped to actually do the counseling work of things. And that I have seen counseling in the church by people who are ill-equipped to counsel do way more harm than be helpful.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's healthier to err on the side of I'm going to refer more quickly than I'm not going to, than to err on the side of I've now stepped into some trauma or some hurt or some grief that I have no idea what to do with, and now I'm neck deep in this with this family, and I haven't been able to help them whatsoever, and now they're stuck even more, right? So I think that, like, being able to find good quality counselors who are able to address some of the things that come up in the church more often. Grief is a big one. Family conflict is a big one. Resentment is a big one, right? So being able, and you probably see anxiety and depression and some of that type of stuff present in the church as well. But some of those bigger things that you see often, especially in children's ministry, I mean, you're dealing with kids and then also the families. And so a lot of what you're going to probably come across is stuff that's happening within the context of the family relationship. And so finding some good counselors that you can trust to send them to when those things do come up.
Yeah, that's awesome. Joel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We'll link all the things in the show notes so that people know where to find you if they're in the Fort Worth area. Maybe they can add you to the recommendation list or your podcast, all the things that you are doing to just serve your community and the greater church community world, all the things. Yeah. So I'm grateful for the work that you're doing and grateful that you were able to be on this episode.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm grateful too. Thank you for this. This is a really important conversation that I think is needed within the church and the church community. And so I just want to give you props on that, like being willing to jump into this conversation and put it out there for people, because it's so important and so needed. And I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to be able to be on here and talk through some of this stuff.
Great. Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thanks.